If you grew up in the South, you remember the sound before the taste. The soft clatter of casserole lids, the laughter echoing through the fellowship hall, and the murmur of grace being said over a table that looked like a quilt made of food. Before restaurants, recipe blogs, and viral cooking videos, there was the church potluck, a sacred ritual of comfort, community, and care. These weren't catered meals or showpieces. They were love letters in Pyrex dishes, passed from kitchen to kitchen, table to table. Every dish had a story, and every bite carried a piece of someone's home. To outsiders, it might have looked simple: fried chicken, deviled eggs, jello salads, pies, and casseroles lined up in endless rows. But to those who lived it, each dish was a thread in the fabric of Southern life. Corn pudding whispered of summer harvests. Copper pennies gleamed with Depression-era thrift. Lady P salad spoke of quiet Sunday lunches under magnolia trees. And every recipe, no matter how humble, carried with it a trace of memory, of hands that worked hard, prayed often, and cooked from the heart. For Southern grandmothers, the potluck table was a stage of devotion. They weren't cooking for recognition. They were cooking to belong, to nurture, and to preserve a way of life that valued generosity over perfection. Food was an offering, not just to God, but to neighbors, friends, and even strangers who needed a reminder that they were part of something larger. In those church basements and fellowship halls, the South revealed its true spirit, one that wasn't built on wealth or grandeur, but on small acts of care. A scoop of cornbread salad, a slice of pineapple upside-down cake, a jar of pickled okra. Each told a story of survival and sweetness, of women who measured ingredients by memory and poured their hearts into the simplest things. Today, many of those recipes have faded from the spotlight, tucked away in handwritten cards or old cookbooks, stained with butter and time. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear the faint echo of that Sunday gathering, the call for seconds, the rattle of spoons, the laughter after service. The dishes may have changed, but the spirit hasn't. This is the story of one Copper Pennies, the salad that looked like spare change. At first glance, it looked like a bowl of bright copper coins glinting under the fellowship hall lights. But one bite told a different story. This wasn't spare change. It was a memory from the days when thrift met pride at the church potluck table. Copper pennies appeared in Southern kitchens sometime around the 1940s and 50s, right when families were rebuilding after hard years. It was made from sliced carrots, onions, and bell peppers, marinated in a sweet and tangy sauce of vinegar, sugar, and canned tomato soup. The recipe spread fast because it was simple, pretty, and could sit in the fridge for days without losing its shine. Women carried it in covered dishes to Sunday lunches and funeral gatherings, where it added a burst of color among the casseroles and baked meats. Part of what made it special was its honesty. It wasn't meant to impress, just to comfort. It used what every kitchen already had: a can of soup, a bag of carrots, a little sugar. Yet it became a potluck staple because it carried a taste of care. Every forkful felt like the warmth of a kitchen light left on. What many never realized was that this salad had roots in lean times. During the Depression, when groceries were scarce, carrots and vinegar were cheap, and women learned how to make something cheerful out of next to nothing. By the 1960s, copper pennies became a symbol of the South's ability to turn frugality into beauty, proof that even hard years could taste sweet. When those Pyrex bowls were emptied and carried home, there was always one dish that seemed to follow close behind, a softer, humbler taste of summer on the same potluck tables: Two Lady Pea salad, the delicate dish of the Delta. There was something almost polite about Lady Pea salad. It never shouted for attention or demanded the center of the table. It was quiet, pale, and unassuming. The kind of dish you might overlook at first glance, only to realize later that it carried the soul of a Southern summer in every spoonful. Lady peas, smaller and lighter than black-eyed peas, were grown across Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, often in backyard gardens where the soil stayed warm and forgiving. They were tender, buttery little things, sometimes called the aristocrats of the field peas. In the humid heat of July, families would shell them on the porch, their fingers working rhythmically as the evening cicadas hummed. Those same peas, once boiled with a bit of salt and bacon grease, found their way into Sunday dishes that cooled on the counter before being packed up for church suppers. The salad itself was born out of the South's knack for stretching the harvest. Cooks mixed the soft, earthy peas with diced boiled eggs, chopped celery, a spoonful of sweet pickle relish, and a dressing of mayonnaise thinned with a splash of pickle juice. Some added a touch of pimiento for color, or crumbled bacon when times were good. It was meant to be eaten cold, served from a chilled glass bowl, a refreshing contrast to the fried chicken and casseroles that dominated the table. In those fellowship halls and covered dish dinners, Lady Pea salad held a special place. It wasn't rich or indulgent, but it spoke to something deeper: care without extravagance. It was a dish built on timing and tenderness. You couldn't rush peas, and you couldn't fake the patience it took to make them right. For many grandmothers, it was a quiet show of skill, a subtle reminder that good food didn't have to be loud. What's touching about it now is how easily it's been forgotten. As frozen vegetables and premixed salads took over, Lady Peas disappeared from grocery stores and slowly from family tables. But for those who remember, the taste still lingers: light, savory, and just a bit sweet, like the memory of a song half heard through an open church window. By the time the last spoonful was scraped from the bowl, the next dish waiting in line was a richer, golden promise, one that always seemed to smell like Sunday itself. 3. Corn pudding, golden comfort in a casserole dish. No matter how crowded the church basement tables were, you could always spot the corn pudding. It sat there glowing under the flicker of fluorescent lights, golden, soft, and just barely holding together. It wasn't quite a casserole, not quite a custard, but something in between. A dish born from simple ingredients and the belief that comfort should always come warm. Corn pudding has roots that run deep in the South's history, long before church cookbooks and potluck traditions. The recipe traces back to early colonial kitchens, where enslaved cooks and farmers learned to blend European custard techniques with native corn. It was a way to turn field corn and fresh eggs into something nourishing when the pantry was bare. By the time it reached the 20th century, every Southern cook had her own version, Saleh, written in looping cursive on a grease-stained index card. Corn kernels, milk or cream, butter, sugar, and sometimes just enough flour to hold it all together. What made corn pudding special wasn't its flavor alone, it was its place at the table. It fit anywhere. It could sit beside roast ham, fried chicken, or even baked fish, and no one questioned it. Some grandmothers baked it firm enough to slice cleanly, others left it soft and spoonable, almost like a dessert. It was forgiving, the kind of dish that didn't mind being reheated, shared, or forgotten for a minute while someone said grace twice. At church potlucks, it was often the first to disappear. The sweetness of the corn, the buttery aroma, the way it shimmered slightly when you scooped into it, it felt like sunshine on a plate. In many families, it was a holiday dish, too, a fixture at Easter or Christmas dinners. But at its heart, corn pudding belonged to the Sundays when life felt ordinary, when everyone brought a little something, and somehow the table overflowed. What made it endure wasn't just nostalgia, but trust. You could always count on corn pudding. It didn't need fancy cheese or a garnish. It just needed care. The steady hand that whisked the eggs, the soft scrape of a spoon across a mixing bowl, the quiet patience of waiting for it to set in the oven. When the last pan was scraped clean and the voices in the fellowship hall turned to laughter, there was always another scent in the air, a richer one, layered with cocoa, sugar, and southern pride. It was the dish that turned every Sunday into a small celebration. 4. Red velvet sheet cake, Sunday's showstopper. There was always a hush when the red velvet cake appeared. Not the kind of silence that came from reverence, but the kind that came from awe, the kind that they made every child stop talking mid-sentence and every grandmother smile with quiet satisfaction. Among the rows of casseroles, salads, and gelatin molds, the red velvet sheet cake stood out like a jewel, its deep crimson hue shining under the dim lights of the church fellowship hall. Long before it became a bakery trend or a grocery store mix, red velvet was a Southern ritual. Its earliest versions appeared in the early 1900s, when cocoa was expensive and beet juice or vinegar was used to tenderize cakes made with coarse flour. The velvet name described its texture: soft, fine-crumbed, and impossibly smooth. By the mid-century, when Adams Extract began marketing red food coloring alongside cocoa and vanilla, the cake took on its iconic hue and became a potluck favorite. In many church kitchens, it wasn't about perfection. Some baked it in round layers, but most Southern grandmothers swore by the sheet pan. Easy to bake, easy to slice, easy to share. The frosting, a rich cream cheese or boiled butter icing, was spread thick with a spatula, sometimes decorated with chopped pecans or a light dusting of coconut. Each bite struck a perfect balance. Not too sweet, not too rich, just indulgent enough to mark a special day. But what made red velvet more than just dessert was its timing. It often appeared for homecomings, baptisms, or anniversaries, moments that marked both joy and endurance. It was the special occasion cake for people who didn't always have special occasions. Baking one meant you cared enough to make something a little extra, to color your table with something beautiful. In many homes, it was the cake you learned from your mother's mother, a handwritten recipe card stained with cocoa fingerprints and butter smudges. For those who grew up in the pews and potlucks of the South, that first bite of red velvet is still unforgettable. The tang of buttermilk, the smooth frosting, the sense that Sunday was something to be celebrated. And just as the last crumbs disappeared from the pan, another scent would drift from the kitchen, a savory reminder that comfort didn't always have to be sweet. Waiting next in line was a dish that turned pasta into a Southern family secret. 5. Baked spaghetti, the casserole that went to church. Every church in the South seemed to have one woman who was famous for her baked spaghetti. You could smell it before you saw it. The tang of tomato sauce, the melted cheddar, the faint crisp of noodles around the edges. It wasn't Italian, not really. It was something softer, homier, touched by Southern hands that knew more about cornbread than marinara. But in that fellowship hall, it didn't matter. Baked spaghetti had become one of those beloved dishes that simply felt like home. The origins of this casserole go back to the 1950s and 60s, when convenience foods were changing the way Southern families cooked. Spaghetti, once a fancy import, became a weeknight staple thanks to canned tomato sauce and prepackaged pasta. But the South, never content to leave a recipe untouched, gave it its own identity. Cheddar replaced mozzarella. Cream of mushroom soup or sour cream might sneak into the sauce. And instead of serving it in dainty portions, church cooks baked it in deep Pyrex dishes that could feed 20 people after Sunday service. What made baked spaghetti special wasn't its flavor alone, it was its generosity. You didn't make it for one or two, you made it for a crowd, with love that stretched across the table. It was the kind of dish that showed up for potlucks, funerals, choir picnics, and youth group dinners. Anywhere a warm meal might offer comfort. It reheated well, froze easily, and tasted even better the next day. Grandmothers prized it for that reason. You could bake it Saturday night, cover it in foil, and still serve it proudly Sunday afternoon. There was also something quietly symbolic about it, the way it merged cultures, adapting spaghetti into something unmistakably Southern. It wasn't about authenticity. It was about belonging. In a region where recipes traveled through gossip, laughter, and handwritten notes, baked spaghetti became a kind of edible scrapbook, a dish that said, "We made this our own." Every spoonful tasted like comfort layered with memory. The sweet tang of sauce, the creamy melted cheese, the soft noodles soaking in it all. It wasn't fancy, but it filled the heart as much as the stomach. When that casserole dish finally came back empty, its foil cover wrinkled and smudged, it carried quiet proof of success. A dish well shared, a crowd well fed, and just as the tables were cleared and the chatter turned to second helpings, someone always arrived with a dish that shimmered like stained glass under the light. Cool, layered, and proudly Southern. 7-layer salad. 6. 7-layer salad. Pride in a Pyrex bowl. No dish announced itself quite like the 7-layer salad. It didn't hide under foil or need reheating. It stood tall in a clear glass bowl, every layer perfectly visible, like a stained glass window of Southern hospitality. From the top of the buffet table, you could spot it immediately. Bright greens, peas, bacon, and shredded cheese stacked neatly over a bed of crisp lettuce. It wasn't just food. It was presentation, pride, and patience in one cold, colorful package. The 7-layer salad became a church potluck staple in the 1960s and 70s, when home cooks began experimenting with visual appeal as much as flavor. The rise of clear Pyrex and trifle bowls helped turn the ordinary salad into something worth showing off. It was usually built in layers: lettuce on the bottom, then peas, onions, boiled eggs, bacon, cheese, and a creamy mayonnaise dressing spread thick across the top. Some women added tomatoes or celery, but the rules were loose. What mattered was the look. It had to be tall, cold, and just fancy enough to catch eyes before the deviled eggs did. It was the kind of dish that said something about its maker. You couldn't rush a 7-layer salad. Every layer had to be even, every pea nestled where it belonged. It was a symbol of care, a statement that you didn't just throw things together. Southern grandmothers took that seriously. They'd make it late Saturday night, cover it tightly with plastic wrap, and slide it into the icebox to chill until Sunday. When the potluck began, they'd carry it in like a centerpiece, careful not to smudge the sides. For many, the taste was tied to the moment. The first cold forkful on a warm afternoon, the way the creamy dressing mixed with the salt of bacon and the snap of lettuce. It was simple, but somehow felt celebratory. Maybe that's why it held such a firm place in memory. It was a dish that made ordinary food feel special. Over the years, as diets changed and salads went modern, the 7-layer salad started to fade from tables. But for those who remember, it still carries that same quiet glamour, a dish that made every homemaker feel like an artist. The layers might have been humble, but together they told a story of patience, precision, and pride. And when that last spoonful disappeared, another dish, far stranger, far sweeter, always seemed to take its place, a relic of the mid-century South that looked more like art than food. 7. Pear salad, a mid-century mystery of mayo and maraschinos. Few dishes at a church potluck caused as much quiet curiosity as the pear salad. It was the kind of thing that made children tilt their heads and whisper, "Is that dessert or salad?" Set neatly on a plate, it was unmistakable. A half of a canned pear, pale and glistening, topped with a spoonful of mayonnaise, a sprinkle of shredded cheddar cheese, and crowned, always, with a single red maraschino cherry. It looked absurd, yet somehow elegant, like a 1950s postcard of Southern hospitality. Pear salad was born in the mid-20th century, when the South fell in love with canned fruit, molded salads, and any recipe that came from a church or company cookbook. Canned goods were modern, convenient, and consistent. You didn't need a pear tree or fresh cream, just a can opener, a jar of mayo, and a bit of imagination. Recipes like this one began appearing in Southern living and community cookbooks, shared under titles like Southern Pear Delight or Sunday Pear Salad. No one remembers exactly who invented it, but nearly every Southern grandmother served it at least once. It wasn't just a dish, it was an aesthetic. The pale yellow of the pear, the white of the mayonnaise, the golden cheese, and that bright red cherry on top were meant to please the eye before the palate. To modern cooks, it may sound strange, but in its time, pear salad represented refinement. It was fancy enough for luncheons and bridal showers, yet humble enough for a potluck spread next to fried chicken and congealed salads. Taste-wise, it was a surprising balance. The cool sweetness of the fruit, the tang of the mayo, and the salt of the cheese created something unexpectedly refreshing. It was creamy, bright, and sweet all at once. The sort of combination that didn't quite make sense, but somehow worked. For the women who made it, it was effortless elegance. No oven, no mixing bowls, no fuss. Just assembly, chill, and serve. As trends shifted and fresh produce became more accessible, the pear salad slowly faded from memory. It was too odd, too retro for modern tables. But for those who remember the church potlucks of the 1950s and 60s, that single cherry on top still brings a smile. It recalls a time when presentation was half the joy, and recipes came from shared community pride, not online searches. When the plates were cleared and dessert started to take over the tables, the next dish to make its entrance was warm, golden, and bubbling. The kind of comfort food that made every church kitchen smell like home. 8. Hash brown casserole, breakfast that became a blessing. In every Southern church kitchen, there was always that one casserole dish that everyone secretly hoped would show up, the one that smelled of melted cheese, butter, and potatoes before it even made it through the fellowship hall doors. That was the hash brown casserole. It wasn't showy or colorful like the layered salads or molded desserts, but it didn't need to be. Its scent alone could gather a crowd. Hash brown casserole wasn't born from a cookbook so much as from church necessity, a meal that could feed a dozen people without breaking the budget. It started showing up in the 1970s when frozen hash browns became a grocery store staple, and Southern cooks realized they could skip peeling and shredding potatoes by hand. From there, it spread like gospel. Whether it was a Sunday potluck, a funeral lunch, or a Christmas morning breakfast, someone always brought that cheesy potato dish. The recipe was simple, but sacred. Frozen hash browns, cream of chicken soup, sour cream, melted butter, and a mountain of shredded cheddar cheese. Some topped it with cornflakes for a buttery crunch. Others sprinkled crushed Ritz crackers for good measure. You mixed it all in one bowl, poured it into a greased casserole dish, and baked until golden and bubbling. It wasn't elegant, but it was pure comfort. Creamy in the middle, crisp at the edges, and rich enough to silence a room. In many ways, hash brown casserole was the modern heir to the old-fashioned potato bakes of earlier generations. It combined everything Southern grandmothers valued in a church dish. It traveled well, could be served warm or at room temperature, and didn't require any last-minute fuss. But beyond that, it carried something deeper, a kind of unspoken understanding that food could offer solace. Whether it was shared after Sunday service or set out quietly in a line of casseroles after a funeral, this dish was an edible form of comfort. Every family seemed to have its own version. Some used cream of mushroom soup instead of chicken. Some added chopped onions or a dash of hot sauce for kick. Others kept it plain, just like Mama made it. But one thing never changed: the warmth it brought to a table, the way people leaned back after a few bites and sighed like they'd just been hugged. As the last square of casserole disappeared and someone scraped the golden crust from the corners of the dish, another bowl was already being uncovered. Colorful, hearty, and thrifty in the best Southern way. 9. Cornbread salad, a Southern twist on leftovers. At a Southern church potluck, every dish had a story, and few told theirs as proudly as the cornbread salad. It was the perfect picture of resourcefulness, a bright, layered bowl of Southern ingenuity made from what most people would have tossed away. Crumbled cornbread, chopped tomatoes, beans, and a creamy dressing came together in a way that shouldn't have worked, yet somehow did, beautifully. The roots of cornbread salad trace back to rural kitchens where waste wasn't an option. Leftover cornbread from Sunday dinner was never thrown out. It might be crumbled into milk for breakfast, fed to the chickens, or, for the more creative cooks, turned into a salad that was as colorful as it was filling. By the 1970s, this once practical dish began appearing in community cookbooks across the South, praised for its thrift, flavor, and eye-catching layers when served in a clear glass bowl. Every version had its own personality. Some cooks added black beans or pinto beans, others used whole kernel corn, bell peppers, or chopped green onions, but the constants were always the same: crumbled cornbread, diced vegetables, and a dressing made from mayonnaise and a hint of ranch or sour cream. The result was something between a salad and a meal: cool, tangy, and full of texture, the kind of dish that felt like summer even when the air outside was cold. Cornbread salad fit perfectly at a potluck because it carried a story every Southerner understood: the art of making something out of nothing. It was the same spirit that turned stale bread into pudding and scraps of ham into soup. For many grandmothers, it was a source of quiet pride, proof that a humble cook with limited means could still make a dish that turned heads. What made it unforgettable was its balance. The cornbread soaked up the dressing without falling apart, the beans gave it heartiness, and the vegetables brought color and crunch. Served chilled, it offered a cool relief alongside hot fried chicken and baked casseroles. You could taste the past in every bite: the legacy of gardens, the rhythm of Sunday kitchens, the memory of hands that never let food go to waste. And when that bowl finally came back empty, with just a few crumbs of cornbread left clinging to the sides, another dish was already being unwrapped, one that carried the same spirit of tradition, only in pickled form. It wasn't flashy or fancy, but it spoke of patience, preservation, and pride. 10. Pickled okra and relish plates, the forgotten starters. Before the casseroles steamed and the pies were sliced, the first thing that greeted you at a Southern church potluck was usually a tray of pickles. Long before appetizers became a word you'd hear in a home kitchen, the South had its own tradition: the relish plate. It was a quiet, colorful prelude to the meal: rows of homemade pickles, pickled okra, chow chow, sweet onions, and sometimes even pickled watermelon rind, all glistening in shallow glass dishes. Relish plates were once a sign of true Southern grace. Every jar on that tray told a story of someone's garden: the cucumbers that climbed a back fence, the okra pods snapped by hand, the green tomatoes salvaged before the first frost. Women spent the late summer months canning whatever the land offered, sealing it up in jars to carry through the cold months ahead. By the time Sunday dinner rolled around, those pickled treasures were opened and shared, not just as food, but as proof of care. Pickled okra in particular held a place of honor. Crisp, tangy, and just a little spicy, it was the unexpected star of the tray. Grandmothers prided themselves on keeping their pickled okra firm, not slimy, a test of patience and technique. Some added garlic or dill, others a pinch of red pepper flakes. However it was made, it always brought a jolt of brightness to the heavy, creamy dishes that followed. Relish plates weren't about luxury, they were about memory. In a time when nothing went to waste, these preserved foods were a way to stretch the harvest and keep summer alive through winter. Sharing them at a potluck wasn't just tradition, it was hospitality in its purest form. A jar of chow chow or bread and butter pickles wasn't something you bought, it was something you made, labeled, and passed down. By the 1980s, the relish plate began to fade from the tables, pushed aside by store-bought dips and disposable trays. But in small towns and country churches, you can still spot them: the old glass dishes with scalloped edges, the faint tang of vinegar filling the air. They remind everyone that before potlucks became events, They were simply gatherings of neighbors, each bringing a taste of their own garden. And after that briny, bright start, it was time for something sweet and golden. A dessert that caught the light and carried the flavor of home in every bite. When you look back on those church potlucks, it's easy to see them as simple gatherings, but they were so much more. They were the living heart of the community, a place where food wasn't just shared, but where memories were made, lessons were taught, and bonds were strengthened. Every casserole, every pie, every carefully layered salad carried the fingerprints of a culture built on gratitude. The beauty of those dishes wasn't in their perfection, but in their purpose. They turned ordinary ingredients, cornmeal, beans, sugar, butter, vinegar, into something that could comfort an entire congregation. They reminded everyone that joy could come from the humblest kitchen and that a good meal, shared freely, was its own kind of grace. Many of those recipes were born from necessity. They were ways to stretch leftovers, to preserve the harvest, to make something beautiful out of what little was available. Yet out of that simplicity came creativity, flavor, and warmth that no restaurant or cookbook could replicate. Each spoonful was a piece of history, a recipe written not just with ingredients, but with faith, friendship, and resilience. Today, when we gather around modern tables, we do well to remember what those Southern grandmothers knew instinctively, that food is never just food. It's a connection to the past, to our roots, and to each other. So if you ever find yourself with a little extra cornbread or a bowl of ripe tomatoes, maybe crumble, mix, and share it. Because somewhere in a church hall long ago, a grandmother did the same. And in that small act, she fed generations. The church potluck wasn't just a meal, it was a reminder that love, when shared, always multiplies.